Welcome to Betrayal Stories. In today's video, we step into a moment that began quietly, almost invisibly. The kind of moment no one ever marks as important until it has already changed everything. This is not a story about reckless choices or dramatic mistakes. It is a story about presence, about the spaces between words, about how a simple favor offered without thought can open doors inside the heart that were never meant to be touched. The office was unusually still when Daniel finally lifted his eyes from the glow of his computer screen. The usual hum of conversation had faded, replaced by the soft sounds of distant footsteps and the muted whir of machines powering down for the night. That was when he noticed Richard Miller standing beside his desk. His coat was already on, keys resting loosely in his hand, and his expression carried that polite exhaustion that only came at the end of a long workday, before Daniel could even ask if something was needed. Richard spoke calmly, almost casually, explaining that his wife's car had broken down earlier that afternoon. He mentioned it as if it were a minor inconvenience, then added that her route home happened to be on Daniel's way, asking if he would mind driving her instead. The request caught Daniel off guard. Not because it was difficult, but because it felt unexpectedly personal. Work rarely crossed into that territory. Still, he nodded without hesitation, not wanting to appear uncertain or unhelpful. As they walked toward the elevator together, Richard spoke about deadlines and meetings, thanking Daniel with genuine appreciation. Daniel listened, feeling an odd pressure in his chest that he couldn't quite explain, brushing it off as nothing more than the fatigue of the day. When the elevator doors opened into the parking garage, Emily Miller was already waiting beside a silver sedan. She stood with her arms folded lightly against the evening chill, posture calm but distant, as if she were wrapped in thoughts of her own. Daniel noticed immediately how different she seemed outside the office environment, less formal, more human. When Richard introduced them properly, she smiled and thanked Daniel for helping, her voice gentle yet steady. After a few polite words, Richard excused himself without a second thought, trusting completely, leaving Daniel holding the keys and a responsibility that suddenly felt heavier than a simple drive home. Inside the car, silence settled quickly. It wasn't awkward, it was full. Daniel focused on starting the engine and easing out of the garage while Emily adjusted her seat and gazed out the window, city lights reflecting softly across her face. He reminded himself this was just a favor, nothing more. A routine kindness, yet something about the quiet felt charged, as though an unspoken awareness had already entered the space. As they merged into traffic, the city pulsed around them. Horns echoed in the distance. Pedestrians crossed streets in clusters. Life moving quickly outside while time inside the car seemed to slow. Emily broke the silence by thanking him again, mentioning how the day had stretched longer than expected. Daniel replied easily, admitting that late nights had become normal lately. Without effort, the conversation slipped past small talk and into shared frustrations. Long hours, missed meals. The way work seemed to consume every corner of life without asking permission. Daniel was surprised by how natural it felt to speak honestly, without guarding his words or shaping an image. Emily listened attentively, nodding, adding her own thoughts. She admitted that many mornings felt planned before she even woke up. That sentence lingered with him longer than it should have, because he understood it too well. At a red light, Daniel glanced over and caught her looking at him. Not curious, not judgmental, just present. The moment passed quickly, but it left behind a quiet tension that felt real rather than uncomfortable. When the light turned green, the city resumed its rhythm. But Daniel felt unusually alert, not nervous, awake, as though something inside him had been gently stirred. Emily asked how long he had worked with Richard. Daniel explained his role, his ambitions, his hope to move forward someday. She smiled at that, saying ambition was important, then wondered aloud whether it ever came at the cost of happiness. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The question felt larger than the drive, larger than the moment. He focused on the road instead, feeling its weight settle quietly in his chest. The city opened up as they moved away from downtown. Traffic thinning, streetlights stretching into long golden lines across the windshield. Daniel lowered the radio, leaving space for conversation that felt easier now. Emily leaned back and exhaled, as if releasing a breath she'd been holding all day, saying the quiet felt comforting after so much noise. Daniel admitted he sometimes took longer routes home just to clear his head. That confession invited more honesty. Emily smiled and shared that she sometimes stayed in her car after reaching home, delaying the moment she had to go inside. Daniel understood immediately. They passed closed shops and darkened cafes, the world outside fading into the background. Emily asked about Daniel's life beyond the office, not formally, but with genuine interest. He told her about growing up in a small town, arriving in the city with more hope than plans, and learning quickly how fast adulthood demanded compromises. She listened closely, reacting with soft laughter at the right moments. When she spoke about herself, she surprised him. She talked about dreams that had once felt urgent but had slowly been set aside, about comfort that had become narrow, safety that had grown predictable. Her words echoed thoughts Daniel rarely allowed himself to voice. Rain began to fall as they waited at another light. At first gentle, then steady, filling the silence in a way that felt intimate rather than heavy. Emily watched the raindrops trace slow paths down the glass, saying, "Nights like this made the city feel honest." Daniel replied without thinking that honesty was rare, but essential. She turned to him, surprised by the answer, and he smiled slightly, admitting he hadn't expected to say it either. They spoke about music next. Songs tied to memories. Lyrics that lingered longer than faces. Emily confessed there were songs she avoided because they brought back moments she wasn't ready to revisit. Daniel admitted he had a few like that too, songs linked to times when life felt full of possibility. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the roof, creating a rhythm that matched their words. As they entered a quieter neighborhood, Emily's voice softened. She said that sometimes she felt like she was living a life she hadn't fully chosen, playing a role she'd learned well. Daniel sensed how carefully she guarded those words. Without crossing any lines, he told her it was never too late to reclaim parts of yourself. She looked at him with an expression that blended gratitude and sadness, saying she hoped that was true. The car slowed as they neared her area. Daniel noticed the shift, the way moments like this always carried an ending too soon. He found himself wishing for traffic, for a wrong turn, for anything that could stretch the night just a little longer. Emily mentioned how rare it was to feel truly heard, especially in conversations that weren't meant to be deep. Daniel said sometimes the best conversations happened by accident. They shared a quiet laugh. Aware of how unlikely this situation was, by the time they reached her street, the rain had softened again. Daniel slowed the car, neither of them rushing to speak. Emily lingered at the door, then quietly said the night had meant more to her than she had expected. When she stepped out and the door closed gently behind her, Daniel remained still for a moment, listening to the rain and distant traffic. Knowing something subtle yet lasting had taken place, the next morning, the office felt different, heavier. Richard greeted him warmly, unaware of the emotional weight Daniel carried. The routine of emails and meetings continued, but Daniel felt detached, his thoughts drifting back to the rain-lit streets and the quiet honesty of the night before. When an email arrived from Emily later that day, simple and carefully worded, thanking him again, Daniel understood that what had happened in the car was not just a ride home. It was a moment of recognition, of being seen. As the day went on, Daniel realized that sometimes the smallest actions leave the deepest impressions. That connection does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives softly, in silence, in conversation, in the space between two people who understand more than they say. And he knew that while the drive had ended, its meaning would linger, shaping his awareness, reminding him that even ordinary moments can carry extraordinary weight when honesty enters the room.